The 2024 legislative session has concluded. But what does that mean? Stick with us and find out. Hey everyone, Keenan Crow here, Director of Policy and Advocacy at One Iowa, and we are talking about the conclusion of the 2024 Iowa legislative session. So what does it mean that the session has concluded? Well, the biggest thing that it means is simply that we have a reprieve from the constant ongoing attacks and attempts to roll back our rights. Now, every time the legislative session wraps up, we normally get a couple questions, and the biggest one is, when do they come back? What does that mean that the session has wrapped up? Congress goes year round. Are they going to meet back again in July or October, or what happens now, right? Well, you're right on one thing. Congress is year round, but the Iowa legislature is not. When we say the 2024 legislative session has concluded, we mean it. And that means that in terms of their official session duties, they are done until 2025. They will start up again in January. The Iowa legislative session runs roughly January through April. Sometimes it goes as late as June. It doesn't have an official end date, but it does have an official time where people stop getting per diem expenses, and that typically means that they're ready to wrap up at that point. So we are currently wrapped until 2025. Now, there is an exception to that, and that is if the governor calls a special session. That doesn't happen often, but it did happen last year. So it could happen, but it normally happens only in response to some sort of major event. So last year it was the abortion ruling. Again, we do have another state Supreme Court ruling coming down for abortion this year, so it's not completely out of the question. However, the most likely scenario is they won't meet again until 2025, and that means that we get a little break. So all right, now that we know how long the legislature actually goes for and that we won't see them again, hopefully, until 2025, what actually happened during this legislative session? Well, a number of things happened, and it was not a good session for LGBTQ Iowans by any stretch of the imagination. We had 40 anti-LGBTQ bills active and ready for debate. About half of those actually got hearings and were advanced forward in some way. Now, the good news is, out of the 40, only 2 passed. The bad news is that those 2 are pretty bad. So the 2 that I'm talking about are, number 1, a DEI ban for our campuses. Now, this is just a codification of current regent policy, but it's still bad because that means that we're not going to be able to change it just by changing the makeup of the Board of Regents. We will actually have to change it at a legislative level at this point. Now, this was a bill that actually got killed during the second funnel, but it was brought back in the education budget as an amendment. And what's interesting about that particular strategy is that the governor has line item veto authority for budget bills. And that means that the governor can accept certain parts of the bill and reject other parts of it. The bill is SF 2435. Most of the bill is okay. What we're asking the governor to do is to veto only Division 9 of SF 2435. And you can call the governor right now and ask her to do that. So if you haven't already called the governor and asked her to line item veto Division 9 out of this bill, call right now. The number is in the description below. The other bill out of the 40 that passed is actually much more dangerous. This is what's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or for short, we sometimes refer to it as RIFRA, R-F-R-A. What this allows people to do is to pick and choose which laws they're going to follow based on their religious beliefs, and there's really no boundary to what they can choose to challenge with a RIFRA claim, from public safety to rentals, people denying rentals to unwed mothers or to unmarried couples because they don't believe in cohabitation. It could allow people to try to sidestep civil rights protections by saying that their religion doesn't allow them to serve LGBTQ people or people of different religions. It's a very dangerous piece of legislation, and we're going to have to watch carefully as to how courts implement it in the future. Now, there are a couple of other pieces of legislation that I want to talk about very quickly because while they were not on our 40 anti-LGBTQ bill list, they will still have a detrimental impact on LGBTQ Iowans. The first one of these is HF 2586. This is the bill to allow teachers to carry guns in schools. Obviously, there are serious dangers for everyone in this, but particularly LGBTQ students. The second component of this that we are really concerned about is the piece that forces school boards to hold a vote on school resource officers. Basically, every school board in the state has already done this. They are very politically contentious, and we know that school resource officers have a detrimental impact on LGBTQ students and students who are members of minority groups generally. So this can be a very, very dangerous time to be an LGBTQ student in schools, and it is only getting worse, unfortunately, due to this legislation. Now, the governor has already signed that last one into law, but the next one I'm about to talk about, she hasn't. And you know what that means. Use that number down there in the description and make sure you call her and ask her to veto it. The one I'm talking about is SF 2385. This deals with boards and commissions. It does a number of really awful things. Number one, it turns the Civil Rights Commission into an advisory board. That's right, an advisory board. While previously it had the authority to rule on these civil rights complaints, now that authority will be solely vested in the director of the Civil Rights Commission, who is, of course, a governor appointee. So this is a dangerous thing, not just for LGBTQ Iowans, but for Iowans across the state, no matter who they are, because anybody can conceivably get a civil rights complaint, whether it's a disability, race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, you name it. All of those complaints are now vested in a single person, and that is not a good thing. Another aspect of this legislation is that it gets rid of all the culturally specific commissions. It rolls them into one big commission, and it actually has fewer voting members than all the different groups that it's supposed to represent that previously had their own individual commissions. I think you all understand why that's a bad idea. Again, call the governor and ask her to veto SF 2385. Now, we talked about all the bad stuff. Was there anything good, anything redeeming in this legislative session? And unfortunately, I don't have any good bills to give you, but I do have some news about bills that you might have heard of during the session that are no longer active, that didn't pass the Iowa legislature, and that is a very good thing. So 3 really high-profile bills that we have talked to you about in the past. Number 1, the bill to remove gender identity as a class from the Iowa Civil Rights Act. That is toast. It did not pass, and thank God for that. Number 2 is the LGBTQ Erasure Act. Now, you may have heard this called other things. The governor calls it the Woman's Bill of Rights. It is no such thing, make no mistake. This is the bill that was going to define man and woman, mother and father in very narrow ways. It did things to transgender people's birth certificates and initially did things to their driver's licenses as well. Again, the good news is that this bill did not advance. Now, the third bill I'm going to talk about is actually an attempt to resurrect the LGBTQ Erasure Act, or at least portions of the Erasure Act, specifically the birth certificate portions. This was inserted into a completely unrelated bill that actually had to do with death certificates. We won't get into the meat and potatoes of that because the good news is, again, that this was defeated, that is no longer moving forward, that nothing happened to birth certificates this year, and that is, of course, great news. And all those high-profile wins that I just mentioned are because of you. Every time we asked you to come to the Capitol, you did it. Every time we asked you to send an email, to make a phone call, you did it. And that is the difference between a piece of legislation barely passing and a piece of legislation barely not passing. You have the ability to influence legislators. We've seen this time and time again, even in this highly partisan environment. When a legislator hears something from their constituent, that can be the difference between a yes vote and a no vote. And enough of those legislators flipping can be the difference between a bill passing and a bill not passing. All right, so that was a brief wrap up of everything that we were focused on during this legislative session. Of course, we registered on a lot more bills than that, so if you are interested, please check our registration page and see all the bills that we were involved in over the course of the year. Our mandate is disproportionate impact, and anything that meets that mandate, we are going to advocate for, because we know even if a bill isn't targeted directly at LGBTQ Iowans, it could still have a disproportionate impact on LGBTQ Iowans. So with the 2024 legislative session concluded, what's next? Well, of course, Pride Month. It's going to be here before you know it. There are going to be all sorts of opportunities for you to volunteer. And of course, the One Iowa Gala. That is June 14th at the Vibrant Music Hall. Make sure you get your tickets now. They are going to go fast. You can find that link in the description. We'd love to see you there. All right, well, that about does it. Make sure that you use that number below to call Kim Reynolds and tell her what you think of the legislation that is on her desk right now. Get your gala tickets, also with that link below. Make sure you are signed up to volunteer. As I said, Pride has all sorts of opportunities coming up in the very near future, and we will see you then.